So, in our desperate attempt to become canceled for all time, we're going to stir up this topic. So, I really want to talk about this because it really, for me, it has a lot to do with the flags you see everywhere, corporations. I think corporations are by nature cowards and they wait until there's little opposition to jump on a bandwagon. That's why you don't see corporations wading into the abortion debate. But if it ever got really one sided, they would. They just wait and wait and wait, and then they pile on when they see that there's a growing consensus because it then provides a marketing opportunity for them to associate their brand with the value that they feel like is on the rise. So that's how a lot of this works. But what that means is that if we don't push back or we don't provide arguments for why that's not a good idea, and that we don't create enough of a cultural consensus around the fact that this is just should be an off limits topic for corporate cowards. They need to stay away. You don't need to put your flags up everywhere. I think there are reasonable positions on both sides when it comes to the culture. And if that is believed, then I think all of these different groups tend to stay out of it. And then we can have the conversation around the topic as individuals. So that's not what's happening with this topic because I don't believe that the other side has been properly represented. So I want to give a essay to describe the other side because I think the reason why it's so easy for companies and churches and organizations to fly the LGBTQ plus flag is because they believe that no one is hurt when they do that, and that a lot of people are hurt when we aren't properly supporting and affirming the identity of LGBTQ plus individuals. And so it got me thinking, this case needs to be made. We need to have this conversation. And so I wanted to read this to you guys and then we'll discuss this a little bit. Okay, so here goes. I've spent the last few days walking the streets and alleyways of one of my favorite small rural villages in the Northwest. The coffee, the flowers, the food, the views, everything is made so beautiful by the hearts and hands of these local artists. Perhaps the only thing more ubiquitous than the thoughtful touches of creativity is the LGBTQ plus pride flags and signs proclaiming things like, quote, everyone is loved here and, quote, this is a safe place. Really? Is everyone loved? Is everyone made more safe? You see, amidst all of this beauty, I find these messages strangely dissonant. Why? Because these signs aren't loving everyone and are choosing to make some safe and others less safe. But the other side of these well meaning messages is hidden. So let's take a minute to spotlight those being excluded and often injured by the ideology these messages are promoting. Pointing this out is so important because the reason for the boldness with which shop owners and churches fly these flags betrays the fact that they either don't know or don't care about the cruelty their kindness, quote unquote, perpetuates on other parties. So here are 5 parties you choose to injure by flying your pride flags. Number 1, children. Celebrating LGBTQ plus pride is the practice of acting compassionate to some children while being cruel to others. Children are hurt more than any other party by a culture that champions individual identities over family identities. Flying these flags is a signal that the movement that says your sexuality is the place from which you form your deepest identity is deeply anti family. The United States has now surpassed Sweden as the country with more single parent households than any country in the entire world. The other thing that the US and Sweden have in common, along with all the other top countries where family bonds dissolve most frequently, is these places are where hyper individualism is being most aggressively embraced. Children growing up without both a mother and a father are at an enormous disadvantage. But even researchers who have most documented this fact refuse to draw the obvious connection between hyper individualism and refusal to create a culture that encourages children to find their identity in their family over their sexuality. A culture championing hedonistic sexuality and the primacy of sexual identity may seem momentarily safer for someone wishing to explore alternative sexual identities, but it is decidedly neither safer nor more loving for countless millions of children affected by the weakening of the family. That's the inevitable result. So that's the first group that is injured by the decision to celebrate this as a prime value in society. Number two, your ancestors. Every person you meet is a part of a family line so resilient, so resourceful, so powerful, it stretches back unbroken to the very beginning of the human race. Did thousands of your ancestors persevere through countless of unremembered sacrifices in order for their descendants at a time when we enjoy more peace and safety than they could have ever dreamed, choose to end our family lines forever? This alone is reason to not be, quote, proud of LGBTQ plus identities. Challenges like same sex attraction make the tragedy of ending a resilient family line more likely, but this is not something to celebrate. Stop disrespecting the gift of life given to you by your ancestors and celebrate continuing your family line, not ending it. Number three, the third party, is your descendants. Most of our suffering is caused by our short sighted forefathers, and we return the favor by ignoring how our decisions impact our descendants. Break this cycle in your generation. I once read that when a Jewish child dies before having children, the family mourns not only the loss of that child, but the 10,000 descendants of that child who will never now be born. This, of course, is true at the death of any child. But today, instead of mourning the loss of descendants, we celebrate identities that make cutting off a person's future descendants some kind of accomplishment. That's the third group that's injured when we celebrate this value. Number four, the covenant of marriage. It's just a piece of paper. No, a wedding is an act of covenant making before God. This is a brilliant idea that gives stability to entire civilizations. We diminish its significance at our own peril. The reason for the narrow sexual ethic in Scripture is to create a culture that promotes multi-generational families. One man and one woman for life is the only sexual ethic worth celebrating. The reason we throw a party when a couple has stayed faithfully married for 50 years is that something remarkable has been genuinely accomplished, not just for that couple or for that couple's family, but for society as a whole. Now that is a flag worth flying. Instead, today we celebrate the bravery of someone publicly championing their desires at the expense of others. Our culture refuses to face the fact that every time we loosen the biblical sexual ethic, we weaken the marriage covenant at the core of the family for future generations, and our grandchildren will pay the price. The marriage covenant has never been weaker, starting with no-fault divorce and climaxing with the redefinition of marriage to include alternative arrangements. We don't see the cultural cruelty being unleashed by our supposed compassion because it launches a slow-moving disease that will be most fully experienced by those not yet born. So that's the fourth group that's impacted, is really all of society is impacted when the covenant of marriage is weakened. All right. And there's a fifth party that is injured when we celebrate. This is a quote from Bailey Gillespie. As followers of Jesus, our allegiance to the King and his kingdom is our priority. Submitting to Christ as King is an act of worship. Last but definitely not least, any follower of Jesus believes that this world was designed for a purpose by an all-knowing, all-loving God. These flags have become a growing symbol of conquest. They represent an alternate kingdom. They say, quote, we have dethroned Jesus and now worship the idol of self. God never makes somebody LGBTQ+. This is a false identity category created by a culture determined to free itself from the purpose behind its design. Yes, some struggle more than others to live into the design of the Creator, but we don't celebrate the decision to give into the wrong side of that struggle. We should have genuine compassion for these challenges without encouraging a lifestyle of sin, along with all of the inevitable consequences that result. So the next time you see a business or a church proclaiming their compassion, understand the real trade-off of cruelty they are celebrating as well. We become what we celebrate, and today, it takes wisdom and courage to stand up to the collective blindness, to injuries and corruption being unleashed by this ideology.